9 countries have enough nuclear weapons stockpiled to destroy the globe 8 times over. It's about 12,000 bombs, and most of them belong to the United States and Russia. It's a minuscule number compared to the height of the Cold War, when the United States alone held more than 30,000 nuclear weapons. But does the number really matter when just one bomb, just one, fired over New York City could conceivably kill close to 600,000 people?
Former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, said over the weekend that the United States has never been this close as it is now, to nuclear war. Do you agree with him?
Yeah, I do.
I'm Lauren Warnicki. WGLT's 12,000 Bombs is a podcast series examining the election issue no one's really talking about, nuclear policy. We'll feature scholars and policy advocates visiting Illinois State University this fall. Today, we kick off this series with a conversation with Matt Kaplan. He's a nuclear physicist and physics professor at ISU, and he hosts a lecture series on campus, which serves as a companion to this podcast. Really, it was all Matt's idea. You don't have to start with this episode, but since, as Maria von Trapp says, it's a very good place to start, let's kick things off with an overview of the world's nuclear states.
This would be fantastic if I had a map, but we're going to make do because this is a podcast. So you mentioned the outsized contribution of the US and Russia. Let's put it at over 4,000 each, 4 to 5,000. These numbers change all the time as new weapons are assembled, old ones are decommissioned, but it's in that ballpark. So the remaining weapons are distributed then between the United Kingdom, France, and China. So between those 5 nations we've just named, those are the 5 formal nuclear weapons states recognized by the UN and by the various treaties of the UN. It's the permanent members of the Security Council, for example. So those are the sort of formal nuclear weapon states. In addition to that, there are 4 more. So we have India, we have Pakistan, we have North Korea, and we have Israel. So if you were to look at these on a map, you would understand what sort of adversarial relationship each of these countries pursues a nuclear program for. So India and Pakistan don't necessarily pursue a nuclear program because they anticipate a war with the United States. It's because they have border clashes somewhat regularly, and this is their nuclear deterrence to each other. Likewise, North Korea, their nuclear deterrence is primarily to deter United States aggression. China is also similar. It's their means of force projection. As they grow their numbers, they become the world's 3rd nuclear superpower. And then the UK and France, also US allies dating back to World War II, founding members of NATO. And so those are the 3 nuclear NATO states.
Can we spend a little bit of time on North Korea? Because I think
I'd love to.
Yeah, you mentioned, more than 4,000 weapons in Russia and the United States, not collectively, but alone each. And North Korea, I think, has like 30.
Yeah, it's small and it's growing. So North Korea is notoriously opaque. Nothing comes out of North Korea that's not the state-sanctioned statements, and you can't glean too much from that. But you can watch with satellites. You can point a satellite at mines that based on the topography would be where they're mining for uranium. You can point satellites with infrared cameras at nuclear reactors, and you can look at the heat from the warm water that comes out of the reactor. That's the sort of leftover from the heating and boiling process. And that lets you estimate their productivity and how much uranium they are enriching and how much plutonium is being produced in those reactors that could be used in bombs. And so there's a lot of uncertainty about the exact size of their arsenal. It is clear that it's growing, but it depends how much of that uranium they're using for then domestic energy, how much is being dedicated to a weapon. More uranium or more plutonium per bomb is needed. So are they building many lower yield tactical weapons, or are they trying to build higher yield? And so this is not something that's known, but it is known that their numbers are growing just because of what satellites can tell you about their industry.
I think, though, North Korea projects this image that they are this greatest of nuclear powers when the gross number of weapons is so much smaller than what we have in the United States and what Russia has. Is that because you think they parade these weapons around as being a show of strength? Or does it not matter the number that we have because one individual bomb can kill, hundreds of thousands of people?
The vocab word is posture. It's what sort of presentation of your capabilities do you make to the world? And so North Korea, I think recognizes, or maybe I should say the governing body of North Korea, countries aren't individual, but put that aside for a second. I think they recognize the precarious situation of being a buffer state between China and then US allies, puts them in a very risky situation of escalating tensions with South Korea, for example. The war with South Korea, they really treat it like it's on a pause rather than anything that was ever formally resolved. So this is meant to deter US aggression. If North Korea has missiles that can carry a nuclear weapon up out of the atmosphere and rain it down on Hawaii or the West Coast, this then gives the US pause before intervening in North Korea. And so that's the whole point of a nuclear deterrent. And that's why North Korea largely pursues their weapons program.
We don't have quite the same posturing, but we have a lot of weapons.
The United States has these weapons as a relic of the Cold War, and a big part of that is our posture relative to Russia or the former Soviet Union. There were these huge arm buildups, especially in the 80s when there were some 65,000 nuclear weapons on Earth. This arms buildup was partly as a result of I need more than you because every single one of your missiles is in a silo that needs a nuke in order to destroy that silo before you can use your nuke. And there was this really crazy calculus that led to this arms race. But it was very much a posture issue. Even then, it was very different than North Korea-US posture, but it's the same sort of deterrence.
I want to talk about the football and the origin of the football and kind of what is literally in it, but also what it's come to symbolize. So
should we tell them what the football is? Because you used this word out of nowhere, even though you did already explain it.
Well, I looked up the contents of the football, which from what I understand is literally like a briefcase that a guy carries, and that person has to be near the president at all times.
100%.
And within that briefcase is a little black book, another book, a manila folder, and an index card.
And some electronics.
Okay. So talk about the contents of this briefcase.
So the contents of this briefcase are classified. I can't divulge that information because I don't know that information. But there is a lot of publicly available information about this. Past presidents have commented on what their football was like. The Soviet football, or I think it's Boris Yeltsin's, is available in a museum and you can look at it, even though it's not the American football. And it is the tool that a president has with them at all times in order to authorize the use of nuclear weapons. It contains the codes for launch authorization so they can validate this is a real order coming from the president and not someone else or a rogue general like many movies depict. It contains lists of classified locations. This is likely places that the president could be whisked away to, but it's also likely targets and locations of US weapons. And then the last thing is the emergency broadcast system. How do you get a message out to the country? Because a nuclear war is a 15-minute sort of conflict when you have a full-scale exchange.
And so the idea is that the president wouldn't need to be like near the Situation Room or in a conventional setting where we imagine him or her authorizing.
That's absolutely right.
War.
And it's precisely because of these short timescales. So this is a post-World War II. Maybe we should unpack, like, how did the world come to be in this crazy situation where there's a junior officer attached to the president at all times? Nuclear weapons are inseparable from this other piece of technology called the delivery system. So when I say a nuclear weapon, I mean the nuke. I mean the thing with the plutonium in it that goes kaboom. And those are no bigger than a trash can. They're actually very compact at this point. The way that you get a nuke to its target, whether that is the bomber that's carrying it, if it's the missile, or some other means, that's what's called the delivery system. And so at the end of World War II, the only way to get these things around was via a plane. And this was slow. Planes fly, you can maybe see them coming on radar. And so there wasn't this risk of a nuclear war happening like that. It was very much post-World War II thinking that you would even have a day or two, even into Eisenhower's administration, of sort of forewarning that this is happening. Planes have taken off and they're now coming. And so we can get you somewhere, Mr. President. As the technology evolved, faster deployment of weapons became key, because it was seen as a risk of losing your nuclear weapons in a preemptive strike. So if I have plenty of nuclear weapons, they don't do me any good if I can't give the order to launch them faster than somebody else can hit them. So with missile technology, intercontinental ballistic missile, it literally means a missile that's hanging out here in North America and you pop open a hatch on a silo, it goes up into space and then it comes back down on Russia. And that's a 20-minute flight time-ish. I mean, it's comparable literally to orbital times for like satellites because it's so fast and so high. Once these technologies were developed, it became necessary for the president to have this mobile situation room in a bag to be able to authorize a launch from anywhere.
What I can't wrap my head around is what the point is. If the United States becomes aware of a nuclear weapon that has been fired on the United States, our instinct is to fire back. But like, what's the point of that? Is it just, well, you did it, so we're going to do it too?
That is part of it. So this is the logic of the saber rattling and how nations do war fighting now. It's very much a tit for tat. You see this in any attacks happening in the Middle East, Iran, Israel, Hezbollah, Hamas. Every time there's a punch, there has to be a punch back. So it's very much ingrained in warfighting culture. In some sense, you might not expect this 15-minute responsiveness to be necessary if, for example, Russia uses a tactical weapon in Ukraine. But it is very much necessary if Russia used a tactical weapon in Ukraine. The US thought about it for a few hours, used 2 tactical nuclear weapons in order to push back and puff out their chest. 2 can become 4, becomes 8, becomes 16, becomes a full-scale exchange in Europe, becomes a full-scale exchange over the North Pole. And that is with every actor acting rationally in what seems like their interests of puffing out their chest and trying to be the tough guy. This escalate to de-escalate logic that if I just use a little bit more force than them, I have a slightly in excess of proportional response, then we can neutralize it, they'll walk away, is a very dangerous kind of thinking when the escalation is annihilation.
So in the meantime, there's just some guy following the president around with a suitcase. And so to what extent do you think the presidency is really about that? You know, there's only one person that can authorize the use of those weapons.
Do you know why that is?
I do not, but I suspect you.
I would love to tell
you.
So do you know this phrase, commander-in-chief? We hear it all the time. What does that actually mean? It's in Article 2 of the Constitution. The framers of the Constitution knew and believed that the military must be under civilian control, that it would be dangerous otherwise. And so the president, as a civilian and as elected by the citizenry, is entrusted with the stewardship of the military. Declarations of war are a congressional power. The president can't do that. But the president still has enormous latitude to authorize all sorts of missions, the redeployment of troops, the moving of nuclear weapons, and the use of nuclear weapons. The president doesn't actually have to consult Congress or the Secretary of Defense or the Joint Chiefs to use nuclear weapons. It really is solely the president's decision, even though the apparatus puts all these people in an advisory role and the sort of machinery of launch would tend to have these people close to the president. If the president decides that it's happening, then it's kind of happening.
Well, let me take like a step back from that and ask if this is related or independent from the idea of like the unitary executive. You know, like I think Donald Trump has famously said, like, I've got an Article 2, and so I can do what I want.
Then I have an Article 2 where I have the right to do whatever I want as president, but I don't even talk about that. It's a thing called Article 2. Nobody ever mentions Article 2.
More importantly, Article 2 allows me to do whatever I want. Article 2 would have allowed me to fire him.
So it sounds
but
like
I wasn't going to fire. You know why? Because I watched Richard Nixon go around firing everybody, and that didn't work out too well. So very simply, Article 2 would allow me to do.
I could have done anything I wanted. I don't even bring it up because we don't even get there. Absolutely, I have Article 2. It gives me all of these rights at a level that nobody has ever seen before. We don't even talk about Article 2. So, they ruled no collusion, no obstruction.
There have been questions about presidential authority in the recent Supreme Court decision, for example, giving presidential immunity to quote unquote official acts. So has that, and I think that expansion of power really like came to fruition during the Bush administration when Dick Cheney really pushed for that idea of the unitary executive. One of the questions around sole authority of the use of nuclear weapons has been that there are no checks or balances. And I know that has been questioned even within the previous administration.
There are none, and it gets the whole cart before the horse. The point is that the president is the check and balance on nuclear weapons, is we vest this power in one person to be this single sort of source of the cooler head will prevail and all of that.
But the founders knew that that was a bad idea in most cases, which is why they created this three-tiered branches of government.
So it's not impossible to curtail these permissions or authorities that the president seems to have or can claim to have. So even though nuclear weapons fall under the president's authority, Congress can pass a law that states, for example, the United States will not use nuclear weapons first in a conflict. And so suddenly, if the president gives an order to authorize a nuclear strike, the Joint Chiefs and the other officers can say, well, this is an illegal order, and we're also required by law to disobey illegal orders or to not follow illegal orders. So simply by creating a no first use policy nationally, this becomes a constraint on the president.
You mentioned this commander-in-chief idea that it needs to be a civilian that's, quote unquote, in charge of the military. But the president is not necessarily informing military tactics except for this one.
Except for this. So this came out of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, believe it or not. The end of World War II, 1945, was a very busy year. FDR dies, Truman becomes president, and Truman, as vice, did not know about the Manhattan Project and this super weapon that was happening out west. And so he's briefed that this exists, and July rolls around and it's ready to go. And he's briefed about it, that they're going to do it, but the generals make their plans, and this all sort of happens with presidential knowledge, but not necessarily this presidential full sanction that you would expect today. And so Hiroshima gets hit, Nagasaki gets hit, and then on the 10th, Truman's informed that they're preparing the third bomb and they'll be ready to go really soon. They didn't really expect the war to end quite as quick as it did. That really contributed to the mythos around nuclear weapons, is how rapidly the war ended after that. And so Truman was terrified that generals could just go and use another one of these. And he says, no, I have to personally approve any further use of nuclear weapons. And so that's the birth of presidential sole authority. However, during those later periods, for example, during Eisenhower's administration, they were again worried about delivery times and communication lags. And so officers and generals on the front were pre-authorized, pilots, for example, were pre-authorized to use nuclear weapons at their discretion if necessary. And this was really kind of a scary time during this early Cold War. And it was only during the Kennedy administration that they realized that that's a very dangerous and unstable place to be in. If one itchy officer on the front line uses a nuclear weapon, all hell could break loose. And so they developed these electronic locks that go on every nuclear weapon that require that little nuclear biscuit, the card with the authorization code, in the presidential football. And they cannot be detonated without the actual encrypted communication coming from the president.
I think some people have thought that maybe the defense secretary could be a quasi check on the president because he or she has no veto power over the decision to use a nuclear weapon, but does have to verify it, right? So in my understanding, president says, go, push the button. Defense secretary says, the president said, push the button, and somebody pushes the button. Am I getting that right?
It is something like that. And a lot of launch authority is military procedure and doctrine, which maybe I'm less familiar with than I could be. But I will say that there are other nations that do have similar procedures. Publicly stated or not, you can often glean this from publicly available information and statements. Whether or not the power is vested in a ruling committee, whether it requires 3 people such as a president, a prime minister, and a defense secretary. And there's often a lot of opacity and secrecy around these sorts of policies. But it can be distributed, and other nations have proven that this is possible. It can be pre-delegated to other officers or decentralized in a way such that there is an additional check on a single president.
And do you think the United States is unique in this regard? Are there more checks and balances around the authorization of weapons in other countries?
So that's another really great question. So oftentimes these policies aren't quite at this decision-making level, this executive decision, who has their finger on the big red button, but they translate into other national policies via laws, where you can take policy and use that to create a technical restriction that then reduces the risk of nuclear war or sort of buys time. So one example of this is China has a policy of no first use, and they have publicly made this credible. You can sort of believe that they don't have plans to use nuclear weapons first in a conflict, because they have stated that they keep their warheads demated from the delivery systems. And so there's this time barrier of readying a missile to actually deliver a system, unlike the United States, where they're on this hair trigger alert, ready to go.
Are there others with this no strike first policy, or others that I suspect Russia would be willing to strike first? But are there others who would be the initiators that would force a response to nuclear powers that have this "I'm only going second" policy?
The most likely scenario right now is a Russian tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine, especially given the dirty bomb ploy in the fall of 2022. That was a very clear lead up to attempting a false flag operation to frame Ukraine for a radiological disaster, which every expert observer concluded was the pretext to use a tactical nuclear weapon when their campaign was not going well. So it seems like there are these very clever officers in Russia who realize that the way out of their mess in Ukraine is to escalate to using nuclear weapons.
And even under the conventional rules of war, if Russia uses a nuclear weapon on Ukraine, all of a sudden that kind of triggers a response from NATO allies.
We should unpack that. So NATO is the alliance. They're the formal members: Germany, France, UK, United States. Ukraine is not in NATO, right? For everybody listening at home. However, NATO is, if I can put it kind of cynically, fighting a proxy war with Russia in Ukraine. And so the risk of NATO involvement following a nuclear detonation in Ukraine would be very high, partly because nuclear detonations are not highly localized events. There's fallout that spreads into Poland. And so this has been treated as the red line for almost 80 years, since Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Okay.
Everyone has sort of acknowledged publicly that while we have these super weapons, we understand that this risk of escalation is too great to use even one. And so we sort of spend these trillions of dollars on these programs to deter other people who are spending $1 trillion on their program. And the military will say that we use nuclear weapons every day. But what they're saying when they use the word use is that it is nuclear deterrence to prevent other people from using nuclear weapons. And by everyone having nuclear weapons, no one will use them. And we create this kind of negative peace.
In my adult life, and I've been voting longer than I would like to admit, I've only ever heard nuclear weapons and the threat of nuclear war kind of mentioned in the abstract and as an assessment of a political candidate's character. So we look at the candidate. Usually the other candidate says, does this person really have the temperament to have control of the United States nuclear arsenal?
Do you really think Donald Trump has the temperament to be commander-in-chief? Donald Trump can't even handle the rough and tumble of a presidential campaign. He loses his cool at the slightest provocation. When he's gotten a tough question from a reporter, when he's challenged in a debate, when he sees a protester at a rally. Imagine, if you dare, imagine him in the Oval Office facing a real crisis. A man you can bait with a tweet is not a man we can trust with nuclear weapons.
It is never a question of what the policy around that arsenal is or whether or not we should have it?
Nuclear policy is a really, really big thing, and it's an octopus with a lot of tentacles that works its way into everything from pork barrel spending to fund the guy who's running for Congress whose district builds certain components of the missile, to how the United States is going to stare down China over the next 25 years as China builds up its arsenal to prepare to take Taiwan. So this is a really huge issue, and nuclear weapons are really embedded in U.S. culture. But something that you can vote on beyond just temperament is a maybe hawk or dove mentality. And so if we want to talk specifically about the two candidates running, we do have some sense of how we can predict they would behave. Kamala Harris has not given detailed plans for the future of the nuclear arsenal, but the nuclear arsenal is due for what they're calling modernization. There's a plan to spend $1.5 trillion in the coming decades to completely replace and update with entirely new weapons, hypersonic missiles and the like, the entire U.S. nuclear arsenal. And it's a question of whether or not all of this is necessary, or if the same deterrence could be achieved with fewer missiles, or whether the United States can use this as a time to say, hey, Russia and the other nuclear powers, rather than undergoing this modernization campaign and spending this money and then causing you to go spend money where you have to update your weapons in response, perhaps we can agree to some treaty limitations. And then everybody sort of gets a win out of it. This is how treaties have been born in the past, is out of countries trying to stall the arms race, and it's for domestic benefit as much as it is for strategic security.
This is a person who has been very cavalier, even casual, about the use of nuclear weapons. He's advocated more countries getting them, Japan, Korea, even Saudi Arabia. He said, well, if we have them, why don't we use them, which I think is terrifying. But here's the deal. The bottom line on nuclear weapons is that when the president gives the order, it must be followed.
If I can sort of offer opinion as sort of an observer, the nuclear military during the Trump administration really treated it like a blank check, as a lot of these new ideas that are coming out, that hypersonics are essential and these new low yield tactical weapons are essential in order to respond in a crisis where we might need a 5 kiloton weapon. These were born out of the Trump administration and the Heritage Foundation, who inform a lot of his basically create his policies, I would think is fair to say. And so we could expect this to increase. Project 2025 says in very clear terms that they want a really aggressive expansion in arms production beyond this $1.5 trillion program that I've already described. $1.5 trillion is a lot. The Sentinel missile program is already about 80% over budget, which would replace the silos out west. And there's really serious questions about whether or not silos, which invite an attack on U.S. soil, are really essential or useful in the next generation of strategic deterrence. So many of the things that you might think about the candidates' temperaments and how they approach the other issues, that's going to inform how they're going to approach nuclear policy.
The period around 9/11 and the authorization of going into Iraq, I'm not old enough to have really known every detail of how that transpired, but I know Dick Cheney had a lot to do with it. He was really someone who pushed for this idea of the unitary executive. So I wonder what his endorsement says.
Dick Cheney, your father, a beloved figure among Democrats for many, many years. Do you, if you know who he will be supporting or who he'll be voting for, do you care to share with us who he might be voting for?
Dick Cheney will be voting for Kamala Harris.
Okay. Wow. Words I never expected to hear.
Yeah. You know, if you think about the moment that we're in, and you think about how serious this moment is. You know, my dad believes, and he's said publicly, that there's never been an individual in our country who is as grave a threat to our democracy as Donald Trump is. And that's the moment that we're facing.
Donald Trump is unique as a candidate who has the nomination of his party and does not have the clear support of very other big figures in his party. And that also includes figures like Mitt Romney, for example. I don't think we've seen anything similar for Kamala Harris. There has been a very sort of big tent movement among the Democrats. And even with policy differences from different factions of the party, there don't seem to be the same questions of temperament and fitness and mental acuity that plagued the more senior candidates, Joe Biden and Donald Trump.
Has there ever really been a candidate that's part of their platform is like, I don't think we should do this anymore?
Yes, actually. So in the 1980s, at the peak of the sort of second half of the Cold War, after the détente, when things were relatively stable, I would say, between the US and Russia, there was that big spike in the number of weapons being produced. NATO was very itchy. They were very worried that it was finally coming to a head and it was going to happen. The big one was coming. And this was a very popular political stance in the United States and in continental Europe, that this is out of control and something has to be done. This is not right. And so you could run in the 1980s on a platform of enough is enough. When are we going to put the military spending in check? And sure enough, these mass movements actually were instrumental in creating arms control talks with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union could see very visibly that there was this grassroots demand from a big tent. It was everything from environmentalists to people thinking about budgets to high-minded theorists of war. All were coming out in this big tent being opposed to the nuclear arms race that was happening. And so one could imagine this being a real position that politicians will have to take. And I haven't seen it on people's platforms. If I scroll through candidates for Congress, they'll have a few sentences about Russia and Ukraine. But I think we watched the debate and the words nuclear weapons came out of one candidate's mouth once.
If Donald Trump were president, Putin would be sitting in Kyiv right now. And understand what that would mean, because Putin's agenda is not just about Ukraine. Understand why the European allies and our NATO allies are so thankful that you are no longer president, and that we understand the importance of the greatest military alliance the world has ever known, which is NATO, and what we have done to preserve the ability of Zelensky and the Ukrainians to fight for their independence.
Putin would be sitting in Moscow, and he wouldn't have lost 300,000 men and women, but he would have been sitting in Moscow. Quiet, please. He would have been sitting in Moscow, much happier than he is right now. But eventually, he's got a thing that other people don't have. He's got nuclear weapons. They don't ever talk about that. He's got nuclear weapons. Nobody ever thinks about that. And eventually, maybe he'll use them, and maybe he hasn't been that threatening, but he does have that. Something we don't even.
If it's not really being mentioned on candidates' platforms now, it was in the 80s. Compare that to the threat level of then versus now. Is this something that we need to be talking more about?
Absolutely, 100%. I think that the risk of a nuclear war is as high as it's been since the Cuban Missile Crisis.
The former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, said over the weekend that the United States has never been this close as it is now, to nuclear war. Do you agree with him?
Yeah, I do.
This is your idea, Matt Kaplan, 12,000 bombs. You are a physics professor by trade and an avocational nuclear policy expert. So you've compiled this incredible panel of speakers that we're delighted to chat with over the next several weeks. And I want to kind of first hear why.
Why am I doing it? It's because it's important, because people need to know. It's scary to know the things that I know. And I hate that this issue is as scary as it is, but so many other issues are also really scary and get the public attention. And this deserves to be on the list with climate change and every other existential threat to us. Climate change might be a 20-year problem, but nuclear war is a 20-minute problem. And people need to know, and they need to really be thinking about this when they are choosing the candidates they're going to vote for.
I wonder if you can talk about the role of students in the series and kind of what you hope they take away from it.
It's for them. That's really the takeaway. NPR is for everybody. I think anybody can listen to this at any age, but I am on a college campus and I am trying to reach students. This is an important formative period where they can really come to understand and engage with, and by having one-on-one time with these experts, potentially even see themselves pursuing careers in this kind of work. It seems like every Gen Z student I meet, they have the weight of the world on their shoulders to go save it. And maybe this will click for one of them. There's a career to be had. I talk to a lot of these students, and we're recording this just a few days after September 11th. And the majority of students in the class, when this came up, they weren't even born yet on 9/11. So to think about the collapse of the Soviet Union, that's very much approaching this kind of like past century history. And the Cold War, the Civil War, World War I, all of these things are sort of melting into just the miasma of a history class, rather than something that's real and salient and whose impacts they can see. The world is the way that it is today because of what happened in these times past. And I think that this is too important a part of our culture and our memory to lose and forget. So for those of us that, remember duck and cover drills, I'm not one of them, but this was a very scary time, and that fear and that anxiety and all of these other emotions that were felt, they have to be remembered. If we don't remember and we forget, it becomes this kind of history where we think it was bound to turn out okay. And there were so many points in the Cold War where it did not, and it came really close. We are at this very dangerous crossroads. And in 50 years, if we can look back and listen to this episode and be like, Matt was so worried everything turned out fine, I would be so happy to be wrong, because I don't want to be right that something bad is coming.
"12,000 Bombs" is a partnership between WGLT and Matt Kaplan. The 12,000 Bombs speaker series is presented with support from Illinois State University's Office of Research and Graduate Studies. I'm Lauren Warnicki. 12,000 Bombs is produced by Rosalie Truback with operations support from Ryan Denham. Special thanks to the Washington Post for their compilation on Article 2. Listen to 12,000 Bombs on the NPR app or wherever you get your podcasts.